Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition. Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm joined today by Dr. Colleen Callahan, the Director of Professional Issues at the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers. Hi, Colleen, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Bob.
We've had a number of shows to this point on teacher evaluation, and you've given us a fair history of where we are in the state. What have we learned so far? You've been involved in this for almost 2 years now?
Even a little bit longer than that. I'd say over the last couple of years, school districts across Rhode Island have been working very, very hard to implement new teacher evaluation systems. And they've been focusing a lot on the implementation of the new requirements, working together to make sure that things are implemented the way in which they were intended. What we've learned has not really been that surprising. Teachers and principals want to be evaluated. They want good feedback on their practice. They just want to make sure that the system is fair and reliable. Union leaders agree, and many of them, including those union leaders that represent the Rhode Island Innovation Districts, are working very closely with their administrative partners to make sure that evaluators and teachers get the information they need, that they address the problems that they're learning about through the early years of implementation, and that the implementation of the program is focused on what it should be focused on, which is supporting teachers and principals in their professional growth.
In your model, you have superintendents, principals, union leaders, teachers in a collaborative approach to addressing the issue of teacher evaluation. And you've said that teachers want to be evaluated, administrators want to do their job of evaluating them. What are the challenges that districts are finding in this collaborative model? Because they are able to talk back and forth and work out solutions to issues that may arise in this collaborative format. But what are the challenges that you're finding?
Well, I think the challenges exist across all the formats, and I do think that in terms of the innovation districts, we're learning something from the work that's going on in Central Falls and Cranston, in Pawtucket, Providence, West Warwick, and Woonsocket that I think affirms the fact that if in fact you're going to do this kind of work and do it well, you need to do it collaboratively. So while there are challenges in those districts, I think that those challenges are being met, and I'm not just saying they're only being met in those districts, but they're clearly being met more successfully in places where there's good collaboration. In terms of what real challenges principals, teachers, evaluators face regarding the implementation of the new evaluation system, I think you'll find that those challenges exist across all of the districts, and that's what we're hearing statewide from our innovation partners and from the other folks that are working on this new set of requirements. One of the biggest ones is time, and that no matter what part of the evaluation system you're looking at, time is a major factor. This is not your grandfather's Oldsmobile. I think I've said that before. And it is similar but vastly different from the way in which we've evaluated people in the past, and it's taking a lot more time. But I think particularly over the last year, as we're getting used to some of the mechanics of the new system, what the biggest problem is this requirement to utilize evidence of student learning as a way to measure teacher and principal effectiveness. That is required. We have two big components of the teacher evaluation system. One is something that we're all pretty familiar with, and that's the idea of gathering evidence on teacher and principal practice by observing it, by going in and looking and seeing what people are doing. The other is this requirement that teacher evaluation is based primarily on student growth and achievement. And so there's a big question about how do we do that? Teachers and principals will tell you that they take their responsibility to ensuring student growth and achievement very seriously. I was a teacher for a long time. My colleagues in the teaching profession will tell you that we set goals for our students. We carefully monitor their progress over the course of the year, over the course of a unit. We adjust our practice as necessary. And what we look for at the end of the year is to make sure that students have met the goals and exceeded the goals that we've set for them. We want to make sure that each and every student achieves. It's a little more difficult than it sounds to tie that to determining how effective a teacher or principal is. Lots of questions exist around whether or not you can accurately and fairly attach a measure of student learning to a particular teacher, to a group of teachers, or whether or not there are other factors involved. So while intrinsically educators are saying that's my greatest responsibility, they're very concerned about the process that's being followed right now in determining how much impact the teacher, the principal has on that student, and whether or not the methods for making that determination are the appropriate ones.
Let me ask you a question. I spent 20 years in a classroom as a teacher, and I understand clearly that there are a lot of factors in a classroom of 35 students, ranging from parent involvement to whether or not the student came to school having breakfast that morning. Mm-hmm. A lot of factors that teachers may not have control over. But then we come to the issue of assessments, the assessment that's being used as a part of the teacher evaluation system. What assessment is being used and what are the other options?
Okay, good question. On the first issue, we do recognize there are many, many, many factors that go into teacher and student success. And while we have to recognize those, a teacher's job, of course, is to try his or her best to address each and every child's needs. That's the work of a teacher. By the same token, there are some things that are outside of our control, and that's part of what's playing into the concerns about making sure that we get the assessment piece right. So right now, I don't think anybody can miss the controversy around using statewide assessment. When the Department of Education decided, and when the Board of Regents determined that teacher evaluation would be based primarily on student growth and achievement, one of the original ideas was to determine that based on the statewide assessment. And there are lots of questions about the use of statewide assessment for either the evaluation of teachers and administrators, or for things like determining high school graduation, as we've seen in the news, and lots of things being talked about today around that issue. Luckily, the idea of the growth factor, or determining effectiveness based on statewide assessment, is something that's still in discussion, and we have at least another year to continue talking about that and figuring out whether and how that will be used in teacher evaluation. That was a good thing to get off the plate this year, good determination by the Department of Education and the Commissioner. There is another way that is being required by the Department of Education to measure student progress. And it's something called Student Learning Objectives. We usually say SLOs. And they're really, in concept, a good idea. It's something that the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and the American Federation of Teachers fought hard for, something that our colleagues at the NEA also support. And they do so because it's a measure of student learning and student progress that is closer to the classroom. So as I said before, when I was a teacher at the beginning of the year, I looked at what I knew about my students, where they were, where they are. And I looked at those important learnings. What did I have to get through in terms of curriculum? What were the benchmarks for success? What were the standards that I had to meet, or that my students had to meet? And set goals appropriately. You use those goals to check in on student progress through the year, to monitor your own teaching, to monitor student progress, and change things as necessary, provide supports as necessary, and then as we move toward the end of the year, to determine how far your students have progressed. And so that seems on its face to be the right way, or at least a better way, to be able to determine how much progress students have made during the year. The problem with using it right now as a factor in determining teacher effectiveness, principal effectiveness, is that we're just learning about how to do this right. And so while it sounds like something that we can all nod our head about because it's pretty familiar, the process that has been laid out has is proving to be very cumbersome, somewhat time-consuming, and until there's the right amount of training and practice given, there's not the kind of consistency we need to make sure that we can use that measure in a high-stakes environment, to make sure that if, in fact, we're going to factor that in to a teacher or a principal's final effectiveness rating, that we are very, very sure that it's an appropriate measure, that whether or not the measure, the objectives have been met, are fairly determined. And then, quite frankly, the big mystery of all of it is how that number is put together with the other evidence of teacher practice to come up with a final effectiveness rating. It's
often been said that, you know, the teachers union is going to come up with their own slant on the issue of student learning outcomes. And, you know, I hate using SLOs and acronyms, and education is full of them. But there has been a lot of discussion around SLOs lately and around these student outcomes or student learning outcomes. Recently, the Federation of Teachers, the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers, and the Innovation Districts commissioned a report from a third party. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming that was done specifically so that you could cite a non-biased opinion around SLOs, their values, and how they fit within the system. What did the report say? This is the report. It's called Focus on Rhode Island, and you're absolutely correct. The Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and the Innovation Districts wanted to make sure that we dug a little bit more deeply into the questions and the concerns that we were hearing from principals, from teachers in our districts, and quite frankly, at the Federation of Teachers, that we were hearing from teachers and principals across the state. The NEA was hearing very similar things, and in fact, last year we did a poll and had a resolution adopted that expressed our concern and the concern of our members about the way in which student learning objectives were being rolled out. But we did think it was important to find out what the experts thought of this, and so we commissioned a study, an analysis of the student learning objective design and process by a group called the Community Training and Assistance Center. We use another acronym for them. We call them CTAC. But they are essentially the one of the premier research organizations in the country with experience on student learning objectives. And so we contracted with them to conduct an analysis, as I said before, of the design and the implementation of SLOs. To do that, they surveyed teachers in 10 districts, the 6 innovation districts and 4 additional districts, so that they would go beyond the innovation consortium. They interviewed principals and evaluation specialists, superintendents, and union leaders in every one of those districts, as well as statewide officials from the Department of Education, myself, Larry Pirtle, president of the NEA, Frank Flynn, president of the RAFTHP. And so they gathered an enormous amount of data. In fact, people were quite surprised by the response to the surveys that were conducted. Usually when you do a survey, I think a lot of people know that you're pleased if you get about 30% of response rate, a 30% response rate. In some of our districts, it was a 90% response rate among all teachers and principals. And overall, it was a 70% response rate. And so we feel very confident that not only do we have the right group conducting the analysis, we had great participation from leadership and on-the-ground classroom teachers, principals, and so forth. What we found, quite frankly, affirmed what we'd been hearing, that it's a great idea, and as one principal said, the problem is we need to focus on doing this right instead of just doing it. And so what we learned were things like issues with communication, that teachers and principals, this was rolled out right on top of the first real full year of implementing the rest of the new evaluation system. And teachers and principals were confused, didn't have similar understandings about SLOs across the districts. Training was another issue. That again, while this sounds like it's something that's a part and parcel of what teachers and principals do all the time, the new system, the approval of the student learning objectives, the assessments that needed to be used to determine student progress, the way in which an evaluator or principal was told to determine whether or not the objectives had been met,
That involved a lot of training, and there wasn't really enough training or deep enough training to ensure that if you and I were each going to review a student learning objective, that the teacher who submitted that student learning objective could feel confident that we would each see it the same way. And so the consistency was a problem. A couple of other things. One is the weighting of the student learning objectives with the other components of teacher evaluation that appear to be out of sync, and clearly at least felt that way on the part of teachers and principals. And the tie to certification, or the high stakes nature of the utilization of student learning objectives, whether perceived or real, is an actual problem in terms of the field embracing this. What the experts tell us is that we should spend time focusing on student learning objectives as an instructional tool, something that we help teachers and principals get better at because it helps them with their instruction, because it helps them know more about students. But because of the current environment, they're struggling with that.
How are you going to use this?
Well, we've just gotten this report presented. I think you'll be showing that we've had a couple of forums where superintendents, union presidents, and then recently a group of about 150 educators learned about the report's recommendations. And the recommendations are very close to what I just told you in terms of the findings. And so we intend to use this report to continue our advocacy for getting student learning objectives right. We want to continue to ask for a separation of the use of student learning objective ratings from teacher effectiveness ratings until we're certain that the system is valid and reliable and can be used appropriately for those purposes. And last but not least, we're going to honor our commitment to continue to provide the information and training that we think is necessary so that as we're doing this advocacy, we will be working in the districts on student learning objectives and helping our teachers see them first and foremost as an instructional tool, something that will benefit them in their practice, but most importantly, benefit students, because we'll have better data on where they start the year, where they end the year, and the kinds of strategies that teachers need to employ to help them really achieve the goals that we set for them.
Let me go back to something that we talked about a long time ago, and I'll make this short and to the point. You just said something that you provided the support for teachers to get the kind of training that they require to be effective, particularly the people in your innovation districts where you have I3 coordinators that are going in supporting this initiative in each one. How much money has the Federation of Teachers, or not even how much money, describe for me very quickly the kind of professional development that's been provided by the union to ensure that teachers are supported in this initiative?
Well, over the last 4 years, the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers has been able to secure grants from the American Federation of Teachers, from the United States Department of Education, and from the Gates Foundation to provide evaluator training. So interestingly, we've been spending a lot of time, effort, and funding to train principals and evaluators in the methodology of evaluation. The Department of Education has actually provided the training for evaluators in student learning objectives. That's a Rhode Island Department of Education requirement, and it was not part of the design that we came up with for evaluation. However, we are finding that teachers and principals need more support in terms of effectively implementing student learning objectives. So we have recently committed and are working with our point people on evaluation and our other professional development experts through the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and the Innovation Consortium to better understand what supports teachers and principals need. And we've already begun providing some training modules for informational and hopefully in the future over the course of this year for more direct training purposes to help support the work that we know needs to happen in the districts.
Well, I want to thank you for coming. I want to compliment you and the Federation of Teachers for your commitment to this model, for seeking out the funds to be able to support the model, and for the collaboration that you've done with the Department of Education, with superintendents, and with principals in the school to ensure that the model is effective for students and for teachers. I want to thank you for attending today. I want to thank you for viewing. We look forward to ongoing discussions around the issue of teacher evaluation, student learning outcomes, and a whole variety of things that are being looked at by the state and in cooperation with the Federation of Teachers and the NEA around this issue on teacher evaluation. Thank you for watching this evening, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, I'd like to ask a couple questions to you as well. You don't need to use your red or green. I'd just like to ask you, how many of you think that our children, America's children, are so stupid and so lazy that they can't learn? How many of you think that? Nobody thinks that? Okay. How many of you believe that the majority of our teachers are so lazy or so incompetent that they can't teach? Nobody believes that. Then how do you account for the fact that more than 2/3 of our students can't score proficiently on these tests? They're deemed not to have learned what they were supposed to learn. How do we account for that? Does it occur to anybody that maybe we should assume that if the kids are trying hard and the teachers are trying hard, and they're still not making any progress? I believe it was No Child Left Behind said by the year 2014, all of our children would be proficient in math and science. And we ratcheted up the tests, and we ratcheted up the pressure. We failed schools, we failed students, and we haven't made any progress. 2/3 of our students nationally and in Rhode Island still aren't scoring proficiently on these tests. So maybe there's something wrong with the system. I mean, does that ever occur to anybody that maybe there's something wrong with the system? After all, standardized tests are all about accountability. High-stakes standardized tests are all about accountability. You hold the students accountable. If they don't pass the test, they don't graduate. They don't move on to the next grade. You hold the teachers accountable, and now we're going to have an evaluation system postponed for a year because the teachers raised hell. That's based on student test scores. So, how is it that these kids manage to get into high school without having learned what they need to learn, the basics? How is it that our teachers are being evaluated and found wanting in this? Is it because of the system? Are kids not learning what they should learn? Then who's accountable for that? Who's responsible for that? If it's not the kids and it's not the teachers, and I can't believe it's the parents, even though they're often blamed for all of this, I think it's the system. The politicians are the only ones who aren't held accountable for the condition of our schools. They just keep doubling down. It's going to be tougher. We're going to beat the donkey until it runs faster. We're going to demand more. Standardized tests are immoral and wrong. They don't really accomplish anything. They don't contribute to learning. The rationale for them is that they give us a snapshot of how well the system is doing. Well, I've been in this business now for 25 years, and I can tell you, snapshot or no snapshot, we're not doing very well, and we haven't been doing very well, and there are all kinds of measures that tell us that besides standardized test scores. So I can't understand a single reason why we would spend as much money as we do, as much effort as we do, and cause as much harm as we do with high-stakes standardized tests. If it's only to find out how the system is doing, then that's not a very good trade-off. Now, some people say it helps us find out where the kids are weak and improve our teaching and do a better job with the kids. But that's a lot of baloney, too, because by the time the test scores are in, that class is either graduated or move on to the next grade. I don't think anybody seriously takes these tests down and says, oh, we've got to do a better job teaching that unit in civics or that unit in mathematics. You know, Einstein said, everybody has talent and ability. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll spend the rest of its life thinking it's stupid. There are a lot of fish in our system, not just autistic kids or special education kids, regular kids who just don't want to put up with the requirements of the school. It's a one-size-fits-all system. It's designed to prepare kids to go to college, whether they want to go to college or not. The rhetoric is we're preparing kids for college and work. But that's baloney too. We're not preparing kids for work, despite the fact these kids are going to spend a third of their lives in job. They graduate from school, and then if they go to college, and half of them manage to get through, they don't have any concept of what the culture of work is, what's expected of them. We don't prepare them for specific jobs. We don't prepare them for work. So I think that we should start a discussion with tests like NECAP by asking ourselves, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of doing all these tests? To find out if the kids are meeting the standards that are designed to reflect college admission standards? Every kid takes so many courses in math, so many courses in science, so many courses in foreign language, all of these things designed to get you into college. If you want to be a construction worker, or a carpenter, or you name it, even an accountant, that's too bad. You're going to prepare to go to college. That's great for the 15 or 20% of the kids who are going to go on and get a degree or an advanced degree or a professional degree, become nuclear physicists or rocket scientists. But what about all those other kids? They have to go through the same motions because we have adopted a philosophy in this country of college for all. And we're punishing our children by forcing them into college. 50% of them don't graduate after they enroll in college. The average debt they rack up is $25,000, some as high as $100,000. And most of them will go major in business because they don't know what else to major in, and they go because they've been told the only way they're going to avoid unemployment or working at McDonald's is if they go to college. So I propose we start this discussion in this state and nationally for the first time by demanding to know why we are spending so much money and so much effort and doing so much harm with these high-stakes tests. And as was pointed out a minute ago, they're not universally acclaimed. I read just before I came here the memorial address published by the Educational Testing Service on whether test scores are a valid way to evaluate teachers. And this is the Educational Testing Service. And the conclusion was they may have some value, but only under very strict conditions. And done unwisely, they can cause more harm than good. And I think you can say the same thing about tests. Even the inventors of NECAP said it should not be used as a high-stakes test. And yet, we do it. And who's held accountable? The students are held accountable, the teachers are held accountable, and the schools are held accountable. But Commissioner Giss isn't held accountable, and Chairman Mancuso isn't held accountable, and all those politicians aren't held accountable. After the students badgered business and legislative leaders to take this test, and 60% of them failed, I had the pleasure of having breakfast with a couple of prominent legislative leaders a couple mornings later. And I said, how'd you guys do on the test? Oh, God. I didn't do well at all. I didn't do well at all. And they admitted they had flunked the test. And I said, well, how do you account for that? And one of them said, hell, that was 30 years ago. I've forgotten all that stuff. And I said, if it wasn't important for you to remember, why was it important for you to study in the first place? We assume that if we cram kids' heads full of stuff, whether they ever use it, whether they need it or anything else, we've done our job. Will they apply it? Will they ever use it? Will it make them better people? Will they be more constructive citizens and workers? That's beside the point, as long as we get the scores and the grades to move them on. So if we're going to hold people accountable, let's hold people accountable who have responsibility for making the system work. The obligation of the public schools is to educate all kids, not just the middle-class white people from the suburbs, not just kids who are motivated and want to go to college, but all kids, even kids who don't want to go to college. It's our obligation to educate. And if we don't do it, starting with the first day of school, and do it well for those first 6 years, we may as well forget it. To hold seniors accountable now, in their senior year, for things they have never been taught, I think is unconscionable.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week, Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.
Brothers and sisters, both young and old. Okay, it's very good to see the young people here. My portion of the program is going to focus on 4 points, really setting the tenor of the times, if you will. I'm going to briefly talk about nationally what's going on politically, then get into the rise of Luther, the making of him. Thirdly, get into Luther's ideology, and then fourth, talk about the road to the door war, which Scott will pick up on later in the program. Much of the social and economic changes that we see during the early 19th century in America can be best displayed and understood through the Jacksonian political movement of the 1830s and 40s. When Andrew Jackson was elected president, many people believed he could make the American dream come true. Jackson's presidency was called the age of the common man, and he felt government should be run by the common man itself and not the aristocratic notions that really embedded themselves after the Revolution, not only in Rhode Island, but in America. The Jacksonian movement represented not the insurgency of a specific class or region, but really a notion of a diverse coalition, what that looked like. And it's much different, than we might think of today. But it really helped set the foundation of what things would become later on after the Civil War, because this is the time period before the Civil War, that we're going to be talking about today. Now, during the same period, Rhode Island had been rapidly industrializing. As a result of its rapidly industrializing economy, Rhode Island was an early site for labor agitation, and in particular Providence, which hosted perhaps the first region-wide meeting of workers' delegates in 1825. This climate formed because class differences really set foot in Rhode Island, in particular in Pawtucket. It really became a public issue. One of the first class conflicts, as I talked about, in the nation took place in Pawtucket. And what this really illustrated was early inequities in the economic system and the hardships across the working poor. Now I'm going to go into the second part of my program. It's really about the rise of Luther and the making of him. The time period in the early 19th century, it was really right for the growth of a working class radical. It was a time when working class people needed to have faith and hope in Rhode Island. Seth Luther would be that someone to have the faith and hope in for the working class. He should be crowned with being one of the founding fathers of the American middle class. He was a true fighter for the people's cause. He became an organizer and orator for the fight of labor. Luther fought and advocated for more worker protections, the idea of a minimum wage law, the abolishment of imprisonment for debt, state constitutional reforms, the ability to collectively bargain, tougher banking regulations, which we still going to talk about today, and of course, the Holy Grail, universal public education. Yeah. He was especially active on issues pertaining to the exploitation of children and was instrumental in helping pass the nation's first Labor Control Act in Massachusetts in 1842. Seth Luther was a beacon of hope for the working people of the state and also the region. The life of Seth Luther begins in 1795 in Rhode Island. Seth Luther is considered by many labor historians to be one of the most influential labor leaders prior to the American Civil War. The environment in Rhode Island was ripe for the growth of a working-class radical. Luther was raised under the roof of a Revolutionary War soldier. His mother, Rebecca, had deep roots to the First Baptist Church in Providence, which was the same founded by none other than Roger Williams. His brothers made a living through pre-industrial trades like blacksmiths, weavers, and shoemakers, or cobblers, you might call them. Luther had 6 years of a common school education and served an apprenticeship in carpentry. By his own account, much of his educational abilities came from newspapers, books, and also the constant habit of observing others, observation. By 1817, Luther left Rhode Island and traveled the western frontier of this young country. His travels took him through the Ohio River Valley region, upper Canada, and then down south to the eastern portion of Florida. He traveled and survived the harsh conditions for several years with the help of both the slave and the American Indian. Luther would later insist that it was these shared experiences with the same slave and the American Indian on the frontier that gave him the grasp of the basic uniformities that transcended distinctions of class or race. Seth Luther's deep-rooted Christian ideas also, and the democratic tradition of natural law became even more embedded into his ideology. This would eventually evolve into his spiritual and powerful approach, which we will talk about. I believe that Luther's travels out west greatly influenced his ideology in view of the democracy for the working class. This would explain his nomadic ways during the course of his life. When Luther would return in his early 30s, it was an unfamiliar New England that did meet him. It was totally different from the democratic spirit of the West he had become really accustomed to throughout his travels. The class distinctions in New England really frustrated him. Upon his return, Luther worked in various New England mills and experienced the long 13 to 14-hour workdays. That is really unbelievable when you think about it, folks. The long days, coupled with seeing the stunted lives of children, woman weavers, and the rigors of the factory system really took a hold on him psychologically. But Luther would not just go along with the tide. He would try and rise above it. Now this is going to start the third portion of my program. It really gets into his ideology, Lutheranism 101, if you will, the people's patriot and prophet. I am coining it. It's really a brand of unionism, republicanism, and also Christianity. Luther's career occurred at a time when the echoes of the Revolutionary War overlapped with the emergence of industrialization and industrialism. It was a time period when central ideas of the revolution could be contrasted most poignantly with the social ills of the day in America and also in Rhode Island. As the son of a Revolutionary War soldier, Luther often called attention to the discrepancy between the ideals for which his father sacrificed and the realities of the workers' lives that he would see. The American founders believed that justice needed to be protected. They wrote the Declaration of Independence to protect and to demonstrate to the British king and also the Parliament that this natural right was not being protected in the colonies. When forming the United States, the founders protected justice in the Constitution and then also the Bill of Rights. During the Revolutionary era, 11 states replaced their colonial charters with more modernized constitutions. But Rhode Island, of course, retained the King's Charter, King Charles Charter, as its legal instrument of government. However, under this charter system, the urbanized towns paid the majority of the taxes, but really had the minority of votes in the General Assembly. In my estimation, Luther saw this charter and also the capitalist systems as still being ruled by the royal crown. Ultimately, Luther's experiences in the West evolved his ideological positions, but his horrific experience in the factories, I believe, really gave him his marching orders for what he would do and try and set out to do around the world around him. Influenced by his mother's involvement in the Baptist church and also Christian teachings, Luther discovered a religious voice by which to reclaim humanity through the words of God. Luther had adopted a militant interpretation of the Bible. Luther did believe in the purity and powerful words of the Bible. Luther's overall view of things became to be based on a strong commitment to that Republican ideology and equally firm moral sensibility rooted in religion. Luther would often make biblical references in his addresses and instruct the workers and the working class to look to the good old book, the Bible, for that spiritual guidance that they would use in the streets and then making those reforms. His religious visions would reinforce those Republican beliefs in the notion of human equality before God. Luther believed it was the Christian duty to speak out against the injustices so that true religion would prevail. True religion resided in the working man and the women who sowed but did not reap the rewards of labor. Luther argues in his addresses, has this great author of our existence, he says, scattered blessings with a partial hand. Luther argues to the contrary, that all persons were made of the same materials and subject to the same laws of our common nature. Luther lent his voice to the growing outcry for reforms who called for a reduction of the working hours and expansion of educational opportunities. He talked about the mind and the soul of the working class more poignantly in two addresses, in the state of education and also the origins of avarice, which is the biblical reference to extreme greed. For the most part, Luther's push for public education was rooted in the belief that citizens needed practical tools, not just metaphorically tools, in order to benefit from the abstract notions of equality. State-financed schools will make the opportunity for economic development and advancements a real right and reality. Luther makes the following points in his address about the state of education and the producing classes. Before I get into the quotes, I just would like to make mention that I do have some photographs of the first secondary school in Providence in 1843 after the Boer War. They are up here, for you to look at after the program. There are 2 copies, and then I also have a timeline here of events that you could also take a look at. So there is some visuals with the presentation that myself and Scott are doing. Okay, so Luther asserts in the state of education, we are not prepared to show that a spirit of monopoly exists in this country as well as in Europe, which is sapping and mining the very foundation of this free institution. We must establish manual labor schools, open alike to the rich and the poor, for the benefit of all, at the expense of all. We must make labor respectable. In a free government, education which elevates the mind and diffuses the intelligence and leads to virtue is the only sure foundation of freedom and public safety. Without education, a portion of the community is surely to be cast in the shade. Those are really powerful words. Luther makes the following point in another address that really talks and critiques capitalism and how it contradicts with Christianity and the teachings of it. He indicts the whole system for instilling a standard of values based upon wealth, with the inevitable result of increasing the sin of avarice, which is the biblical reference for extreme greed. And he declares that the only solution is complete revision and this notion of democratization of education. No American thinker in the whole early labor movement was really so acutely conscious of the world around him, such as Luther. And you talk about the whole worldwide implications of the economic system. It might have been happening over in Europe, in particular in Britain, but it is really important, to know that Seth Luther was really at the forefront of that type of ideology. In Luther's words, the great author of our existence did not design the world so that many people should be poor and miserable. in order that the few may roll and riot in splendid luxury. Luther believed that the practice of imprisoning people for debt trampled under the foot in every principle of the practices of Jesus Christ. The attacks on Luther were not always verbal, though. Along with calling his rhetoric for the 10-hour day Jacksonian tricks by the Providence Journal, he was assaulted physically and blacklisted as well. When assaulted for his activities and teachings, he boldly responded as blood would stream down his face. I glory in these wounds, knowing that they would not have been inflicted had I not advocated the cause of the suffering children incarcerated in the cotton mills of our very once happy New England town. Those are very powerful words. Now I will go to the last portion of my program, which will bring us to the Door War, the road to the Door War. Luther's militant speeches and writings began to circulate wherever Unionists would gather, especially throughout New England. During the 1830s, wage earners organized a working man's movement which demanded political and then economic rights also. Luther would be at the forefront of those movements in many ways. By 1832, Luther would be heavily involved in Rhode Island politics and was in a delegation of workers which called on the governor of Rhode Island at the time to enlist his support for the 10-hour day. He saw that the future of the producing classes could only be advanced through collective action and union through the idea of the labor movement. Furthermore, that year he traveled extensively and made speeches to rally support for the Boston strikers who threw down their tools in order to win the 10-hour day. He also began writing and selling subscriptions for a labor paper called the New England Artisan. In 1834, he was one of the founders of the Trades Union of Boston and the vicinity. He was also an active member of the National Trades Union until its collapse in the Panic of 1837. The General Trades Convention in Boston in 1834 selected him as one of the secretaries, and then a year later he helped draft a manifesto, if you will, for the Boston Circular in favor of the 10-hour day, which was reprinted in Philadelphia, where they had a strike and they shut down the city. In 1835, he addressed the National Trades Union Convention on the condition of women and children in the cotton mills. He was truly all over the place, folks. Now let's bring it back to Rhode Island. Seth Luther was a leader and organizational secretary for the People's Party, and he became a speaker for the Rhode Island Suffrage Association, which will lead us into the Door War. In closing, I would like to share a quote that I think best illustrates what Luther and the Door War was all about. Now, the fact that his father had participated in the American Revolution really seemed to give him some type of advocacy for its completion. The working man bared their arms and their bosoms in 76, which is 1776. And they are about to do it again in 36. The working man of 76 stood on our battlefields, scorned the mercy and defying the power of the foreign tyrants. And we of 36 despise the power of the domestic foes. The minions of domestic tyranny must be made to know and feel that a people to be free have but to will it. We will try at the ballot box first. If that will not affect our righteous purpose, the next and the last resort is the cartridge box. And now I would like to turn over the program to Scott MOLLOY. Thank you.
As Ryan said, Seth Luther was really the product of two earth-shattering revolutions, all very close to each other, and that, of course, was the American political revolution, which, of course, had all kinds of ramifications. And then right after it, in 1790, on the banks of the Blackstone River at Slater's Mill, we had the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And at a time in American history when we're always hearing about Rhode Island being 46, 47, 48th, and anything you can pick, hey, we had the first factory in America. There are no competitors. There are no one out there trying to take credit for that. We're number one. And so we can shut everybody up at least for a couple of minutes. But Luther, who was born in 1795, who was mentioned earlier, he and a group of skilled workers, you have to remember at this particular point in time, it was the skilled workers who really had the say-so in this emerging labor movement. It would be several generations later before the unskilled and the semi-skilled would get taken in. So it's not surprising that Luther was a housewright. You know, and you say, what the heck is a housewright? Wright simply meant carpenter. So he was he did things around a home. And you had shipwrights, who were carpenters on boats and vessels. And there were several other kinds as well. And Ryan also mentioned that his brothers were all skilled artisans themselves, and they hung around with printers and other people similarly situated. Luther would complain vociferously whenever he had the opportunity, which apparently was frequently, that he felt that Rhode Island was particularly backward in the sense and in particular because so few people had the right to vote here. This was a glaring error, one that made us the laughing stock of the new nation. And as some of you know, and we'll see in a minute in the Dorr War, you had to own $134 worth of real estate. You couldn't have it in the bank. You had to own real estate or property because this gave you a stakeholder, if you will, in society around you because land was everything in those days. And so $134. What did that mean? It meant that by 1840, 60% almost of all Rhode Islanders, white males over the age of 21, born in America, could not vote. And 40% ruled the rest of our society. And there were only approximately 8,000 landholders who could vote. And ironically, among them were 2,000 eldest sons. And I'll pass this around because I do this in my class all the time. It's like makes it into kind of a museum situation. The kids actually get to say, oh my God, that thing really does say that. You know, hey, the teacher, you were telling the truth. You know, I said, thank you very much. It's nice to know that I was doing that. In order to vote, you had to have one of these little documents from the town clerk, and it said you held a freehold estate. It had nothing to do with slavery. It meant that you had a piece of property worth $134, which freed you up to vote. If you didn't have it, you didn't vote. You could still pay taxes. Or as Seth Luther would often complain, you had to serve in the militia or the fire brigades or maybe do municipal work a few days or a week every year in order to pay off your taxes. I'm always telling the kids at URI that if they don't watch it and this ever comes back, they're going to be out shoveling the snow off Route 138 as part of their tuition payments. And they kind of look like, you're only kidding, aren't you, Professor? Sure.
Hi, my name is Mary Harrington, and I am with the Rhode Island Labor History Society. In this Labor Vision series, we explore some of the people and places that make up Rhode Island's rich labor history. In our first segment, we discussed Samuel Slater's successful use of machines for the first time in America to turn cotton into thread, using water power harnessed from the Blackstone River here in Pawtucket. This is an achievement historians consider one of the most important events in America's early industrial history. Today we are back in Pawtucket to discuss yet another important historical event in early Rhode Island labor history, that being the 1824 strike of women weavers. This is one of the first strikes in Rhode Island and American history, and the very first strike that included women. In fact, the women initiated it. By 1824, there were 8 water-powered cotton mills here in Pawtucket. For the past 2 summers, there had been severe droughts affecting cloth production, and profits were declining. Despite deep divisions among the mill owners over water rights and other matters, they got together and decided to cut costs in the mills by cutting the wages of the women weavers by 25% and to increase the workday for the entire workforce by an hour. By targeting the women weavers for the pay cuts, the owners expected little resistance. But they were wrong. Instead, they faced a unified group of women who now made up a quarter of the mill's workforce. This is because of a brand new machine called a power loom that wove thread made in the mills into cloth. A large number of women had settled in Pawtucket to become weavers, although they were paid much less than the men and endured the same harsh working conditions. These new power looms required more skill to operate than the spinning machines Slater had children operate. On the first day of the strike, the women met, chose a leader, calling it a turnout. They walked away from their looms. A local newspaper called it a riot. The women resolved not to return until the owners reversed their decision on the pay cuts and the extended workday. It is more than likely that in the years since Slater built his first small mill and employed children for his machines, that the growing number of cotton mill workers had numerous disputes over wages and work rules with the mill owners. But up until this time, neither side had ever taken collective action. So why were these women able to walk off the jobs and close the mills down for a week? A major reason is that they had the support of the community. Since the 17th century, Pawtucket had been growing as an industrial town and now had a diverse array of industries and artisans and a sizable shipbuilding operation. It was not an isolated mill village where the mill owner had nearly complete control over his workers. More importantly, Pawtucket workers remained wary of the changes of industrialization. They remembered the pre-industrial workday where the sun and not the clock and the machinery set the pace of the workday. In short, the new power and authority of the mill owners felt like tyranny, and they feared that the new strict work rules would rob them of the freedoms their colonial ancestors had fought for in the American Revolution. So when the women initiated the strike, they were joined by fellow workers who surrounded the mills with them, joined them at the homes of the mill owners to express their rage, and filled the streets in the evening. We do know that the mill owners met to write a statement defending their actions and to come up with a compromise. We don't know what that compromise was. We do know that a few days later, the local newspaper reported that the cotton mills were up and running. And for the time being, with the support of their fellow workers, the women weavers had successfully limited the power and authority the mill owners had over their lives.